Chapter 3 of The Power of Israel in the United States by James Petras. The Libby Affair and the Internal War. The national debate that the indictment of Irving Louis Libby for perjury and obstruction of justice has aroused in the mass media has failed to address the most basic questions concerning the deep structural context which influenced his felonious behavior. The most superficial explanation was that Libby, by exposing Valerie Plame, an undercover CIA agent, acted out of revenge to punish her husband Joseph Wilson for exposing the lies put forth by Bush about Iraq's purported importation of uranium from Niger. Other journalists claim that Libby acted to cover up the fabrications to go to war. The assertion, however, raised a deeper question. Who were the fabricators of war propaganda? Who was Libby protecting? And not only the fabricators of war, but the strategic planners, speechmakers, and architects of war who acted hand in hand with the propagandists and the journalists who disseminated the propaganda. What was the link between all these high-level functionaries, propagandists, and journalists? Equally important, given the positions of power which this cabal occupied and the influence they exercised in the mass media, as well as in designing strategic policy, what forces were engaged in bringing criminal charges against a key operative of the cabal? To best understand the rise and apparent fall of Irving Louis "Scooter" Libby, it is essential to recognize that he was a member of an ideologically cohesive group with a long history of shared ideology, common purpose, and organizational collaboration. Libby's rise to power is part and parcel of the ascendancy of the Zionist neoconservatives to the summits of U.S. policymaking. Libby was a student protege and collaborator with Paul Wolfowitz for over 25 years. Libby, along with Wolfowitz, Elliott Abrams, Douglas Feith, Kagan, Cohen, Rubin, Polak, Chertoff, Fleischer, Kristol, Shulsky, and a host of other political influentials, are long-term believers and aggressive proponents of a virulently militaristic tendency of Zionism, organically linked with the right-wing Likud Party of Israel. Early in the 1980s, Wolfowitz and Feith were charged with passing confidential documents to Israel, the latter temporarily losing his security clearance. This posed no blockage to their subsequent advancement. It's hard to conceive of such a charge being raised in relation to any other country that would leave the parties concerned with a still ascendant career path within American government. The ZionCon ideologues began their long march through the institutions of the state, in some cases as advisors to right-wing pro-Israel congressmen, and others in the lower levels of the Pentagon and State Department, in other cases as academics or leaders of conservative think tanks in Washington during the Reagan and Bush senior regimes. With the election of Bush in 2001, they moved into major strategic positions in the government and served as the principal ideologues and propagandists for a sequence of wars against Arab adversaries of the Israeli state. Leading Zion cons like Libby drew up a war strategy for the Likud government in 1996 and then recycled the document for the U.S. war against Iraq before and immediately after 9/11/01. Along with their rise to the most influential positions of power in the Bush administration, the Zion cons attracted new recruits like New York Times reporter Judith Miller. What is striking about the operations of the Zion con cabal is the very open and direct way in which they operated. Lieutenant General William Odin, former director of the National Security Agency under Reagan, General Anthony Zinni, retired Marine combatant, Colonel Kay Wilkerson, former chief of staff of Colin Powell, Brent Scowcroft, National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush I, and numerous disenchanted officials, including veterans of the intelligence agencies, high-level observers, and former diplomats, openly criticized the ZionCon takeover of the U.S. policy and their promiscuous relationship with Israeli generals and Israel's secret international police, the Mossad, who had total access to their offices. In the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, Zion cons Wolfowitz and Libby were the architects of the military strategy for Rumsfeld and Cheney, their putative bosses. Douglas Feith established the Office of Special Plans to fabricate the lies to justify the war. Judith Miller, David Frum, and Ari Fleischer served to disseminate the lies and war propaganda through articles, interviews, press conferences, and speech writing for President Bush. A review of the leading newspapers and government documents reveals that at every point in time in policy, the Zion Khans echoed, to the letter, the policy demands emanating from the Sharon regime, that the U.S. should invade and destroy the Iraq regime and state apparatus. Not a single Zion Khan in the government or outside in the prestigious private universities or think tanks voiced the minimum deviation from the war policy of the Sharon regime. In what is probably one of the most cynical ploys in recent history, the Zion Khans' anti-Arab, anti-Muslim crusade on behalf of Greater Israel was portrayed as a policy of democratizing the Middle East by those who bombed Jenin into rubble and to those who would napalm Fallujah into ruin. The war within, and their overweening drive for total control of government policy motivated by their fanatical loyalty to Greater Israel, the Zion Khans pushed to manipulate and marginalize many of the key institutions in the U.S. imperial state. To circumvent intelligence from the CIA that didn't promote the Israeli agenda of war with Iraq, Zion Khan Douglas Feith's Office of Special Planning fabricated propaganda and channeled it directly to the president's office, bypassing and marginalizing any critical review from the CIA. Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld totally marginalized the leading generals, promoting nondescript loyalists and outsiders to the top positions, and discarding any advice which opposed or conflicted with their plans for war with Iraq. Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, referred to a speech prepared for him by Irving Libby as bullshit because of its blatant falsehoods. His chief aide, Colonel Wilkerson, has written disparagingly of the Zion Khan cabal, which marginalized the State Department, including his boss, Powell. Nonetheless, Powell went on to front a further range of lies to the world at large at the UN. Finally, the FBI has been engaged in permanent warfare with the Israeli Mossad regarding the massive and conspicuous entry of Israeli spies into the U.S. Hundreds have been deported since September 2001. Libby's crime, perjury over revealing a CIA agent, is a minor crime compared to the large-scale, long-term crimes against humanity, international law, and the U.S. Constitution committed by the Zion Khans embedded in the U.S. state. The prosecution of Libby, however, reveals the intense internal struggle over the control of the U.S. imperial state between the Zion Khans and the traditional leaders of its major institutions. Along with the arrest of Libby by the federal prosecutor, the FBI has arrested the two leading policymakers of the most influential pro-Israeli lobby, AIPAC, for spying for the State of Israel. These are not simply isolated actions by individual officials or investigators. To have proceeded against powerful Zion Khan leader Irving Libby and AIPAC leaders Rosen and Weissman, they had to have powerful institutional backing. Otherwise, the investigations would have been terminated even before they began. The CIA has been deeply offended by the Zion Khan usurpation of their intelligence role, their direct channels to the president, their prime loyalty to the State of Israel, and their ignorance of reliable sources. The military is extremely angry at their exclusion from the councils of government over questions of war. The disastrous war policy, which has depleted the armed forces of recruits and devastated troop morale, and at the Zion Khans' grotesque ignorance of the costs of a colonial occupation. It is no wonder that General Tommy Franks referred to Zion Khan Douglas Feith as, quote, the stupidest bastard I have ever met. The current institutional war recalls an earlier conflict between the right-wing Senator Joseph McCarthy and the Defense Department. At the time of the mid-1950s, Senator McCarthy was accumulating power first by purging trade unions, Hollywood, and the universities, and by promoting like-minded conservative officials. He successfully extended his investigations and purges to the State Department and finally to the military. It was here that Senator McCarthy met his Waterloo. His attack backfired. The Army stood its ground, refuted his accusations, and discredited his fabrications and grab for power. Are we witnessing a similar process unfolding today? Will the Zion Khan power grab be thwarted by its overreach into the core of the U.S. state? Or does the appointment of General Michael Hayden to head of the CIA reflect the subservience of the CIA to the Pentagon and in turn to the Zioncons? In any open hearings between the Zioncons and the constituted bodies of the state, the public would be exposed to the real nature of the conflict and what is at stake, namely the choice between Israel first or U.S. political interests. In the meantime, the Zioncons are not at all daunted by the trials of their colleagues in AIPAC and the Vice President's office. They are pressing straight ahead for the U.S. to attack Syria and Iran via economic sanctions and military bombing. On October 30, 2005, the former head of the Israel Secret Police, Shin Bet, told AIPAC to escalate their campaign to pressure the U.S. to attack Iran. Despite Syrian post-9/11 assistance to the U.S., AIPAC secured a near unanimous vote in the U.S. Congress in favor of economic sanctions against it. Despite mass demonstrations and because of a captured Congress, it appears, paradoxically, that the only force capable of defeating the Zioncon juggernaut, like the earlier Joe McCarthy, are powerful voices in the state threatened by new disastrous wars not of their making.